Welcome to Blockchain Recorded, the podcast for the tech curious, where we talk about anything and everything related to the exponentially evolving crypto, blockchain, and Web 3.0 space. Our mission is simple: to share knowledge, facilitate discourse, and help evolve education in blockchain fundamentals, decentralization solutions, and relevant use cases for today's digital economy. We at Blockchain Recorded are not registered investment advisors and do not deal with financial or trading token elements, nor offer any licensed financial services. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only, while the opinions of all parties involved are their own. I'm your host, Nina Cerar, and now let's talk blockchain. Before I introduce our guest today, I'd like to remind everyone to follow us on X, so former Twitter, at handle recorded podcast, where we pre-stream each episode on Spaces the day before distribution to all major podcast platforms. For the full platform list, visit our website, blockchainrecorded.com. And with us today, we have Arjun Bhuptani. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Arjun is a co-founder of Connext. And since 2017, he and co-founder CEO Lane Haber have led the team delivering solutions to simplify the L2 experience. So essentially building the HTTP of Web3. A pioneer in the space, Arjun was previously a leading developer in building on Ethereum and a co-creator of the Moloch DAO, one of the earliest decentralized autonomous organization frameworks developed in 2018. Arjun, welcome to Blockchain Recorded.
Thank you so much for having me, Nina.
Pleasure is all mine. Well, Arjun, I understand you are quite the OG and veteran in the crypto Web3 space. This is the typical question that I'm sure you get on all the talks that you give, and feel free to go any way you want. What led you to this Web3 path?
Yeah, I mean, it's a typical question, but it's a good question because I think if you were one of the people that was a part of this space back in 2016 and, to that era, pre the original ICO era, which really was what kind of made people aware of Ethereum and of these kinds of newer kinds of blockchains. Mm-hmm. If you were a person that was around back then, you had to be a little bit insane, right? Because there's really nothing that the space had going for it. It was just like pipe dreams. And there was such a big difference between what people believed this technology could become and then what the actual state of affairs was at the time. For me, I think I had the benefit of previously being introduced to a lot of this technology just because growing up, I grew up in the UAE, and I just by proxy of having access to, having to learn early on about different kinds of technologies to get VPN technologies and things like that as part of just living in the Middle East. I ended up getting exposure to things like peer-to-peer file sharing and to things like IRC, which were sort of the decentralized network precursors to blockchains. And so I'd always had a bit of a penchant for learning about those types of networks and an interest in the effect that they could have, especially in parts of the world where you didn't have very reliable access to information. And so for me, that I sort of missed the Bitcoin chain because I was never very interested in finance. But for me, when I had friends tell me about Ethereum back in 2016, it just kind of made sense. And at the time, I was very interested in a couple of very specific problems that I think are now very relevant and people are talking about a lot. Problem number one was how are we going to adapt to a world where AI completely automates away just about every job that we have? How are we going to find ways to make it so that the value that is created by AI, and I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's ideally, the story of humanity is to get rid of the need for us to be doing a lot of day-to-day work, right? To automate away things in our lives so we can work on higher level things, more important things. We can do things that we enjoy and we can actually, live lives where we have hobbies rather than fight for survival, right? And so I don't think it's bad to live in a world where AI automates jobs away, but I do think it's bad if it does that in a way where all of that value is sequestered by one or two large companies. And so for me, one of the key questions was, how can we socialize the benefits of AI? How can we decentralize AI such that everybody gets equal access to it and everybody gets the benefit of it? And question number 2 was, how can we take that idea, that model of let's take things that previously large-scale companies have monopolized and then turn those into public goods that are globally administrable in the same way that the internet is something that is just available to everybody, that isn't really owned by any singular company and that can't ever be shut down. And I think for me, Ethereum really represented the first instance of a platform, like a computer that lets you build goods like this, public goods like this, and an entirely separate class category of organizations separate from corporations and governments, which have historically been the two kinds of organizations that human beings have used to coordinate with each other.
Fair enough. I'm definitely going to pick your brain on the AI component because I think it's very, very relevant, especially when it comes to Web3 and blockchain and what it all means. But just to backtrack a little bit, so 2017 is when you started Connext, which by the way, I read it was first a research lab, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah. We kind of started with this fairly simple mission at the time, and I think this is just based off of the beliefs that I had and that Lane came to have, which was just that this technology, we don't yet know what can be built on top of it, and we don't yet know the best ways to build things on top of it, which of course now over time we've learned. But at the time there was a very simple idea of if we want this technology to help a lot of people, we need to make it globally accessible.
Right.
In the lab, our focus was, let's figure out. We were actually one of the first companies to say this, and this is something that I think everybody says now. But we were one of the first people to kind of be like, we want to figure out how to bring Ethereum to 1 billion people, and that was the mission of Connext, starting all the way back in 2017,
which was partly fortunate, but then partly unfortunate due to the ICO hopes and dreams, promising rogue side of it. But fair enough. So I understand Connext has, you focused on scalability and operability and what you just said in terms of bringing it closer to the people or bringing it closer to adoption, but more so how to scale it since its inception. Your website states that Connext is more than a bridge.
Yep.
So if I may quote, it's a fast and secure modular interoperability protocol powered by intents. So that's a mouthful in itself. And although
it's a mouthful.
And I know that, obviously also have said this in some of your previous talks, but so although a lot of the conversations in 2024 are now increasingly circling around intents, and I'll definitely ask you about them, I think it would still be beneficial just to go back and review bridging, which I'm sure is one of your favorite topics to talk about. But no pun intended. It would be great if you can just bring us up to speed with sort of the evolution of bridging, where the bridging concept and practice stands now, because it's not an easy concept to grasp, even for people who have been, I don't know, like myself, I'm not a computer scientist, but I've been around since 2016, but still there was a confusing phase, and just interested in how you see the state of bridging today in 2024? Yeah, it's a good question. And I think part of the challenge is that it's such a complex topic, and it's something that requires so much context that especially if you're a person that's just jumping into it, it can be really difficult to understand, well, why are we doing the things that we're doing, right? Why is bridging even a challenge to begin with? Why do we need to try to solve this problem? And why did we go from focusing on scalability to focusing on bridging and interop? And I think to answer that question, one really key piece of information is that we believe, and I think most researchers at this point really believe, that scalability and interoperability are really the same problem. And the reason for that is that since about 2018 or so, the dominant paradigm for scaling blockchain. So let's take a step back. Why do we need to scale blockchains? Today, we kind of understand that there is a trade-off space that exists around building blockchains, where if you want to create a chain that is easy to validate by everybody, so any person could validate this chain at home, and you want to create a chain that is very secure, which is of course kind of a non-negotiable, right? You want to make sure that everybody is validating the chain. You want to make sure that it's not easy to attack.
you have to kind of compromise on scalability. And what this means is that there's basically a fundamental trade-off space between accessibility and the like speed of making transactions on chain. And there's ranges on that trade-off space, right? You have stuff like Solana where it's like, okay, we're able to keep everything on a single chain, but what we're doing is we're increasing the overhead to run nodes. And so can you run a Solana node at home as an individual person on your computer? No, not really. Can you do that with Ethereum? Yes. So it's just kind of different points in that trade-off spectrum, and they're both valid points to be at. For Ethereum, the core idea was we need to ensure that the Ethereum blockchain is as secure as possible, because the threat model for the Ethereum blockchain, and threat model is a term that we use in cryptography and computer science to describe what potential attack vectors exist to take the system down, right? So the threat model for Ethereum was World War III. If we end up in a world where all of a sudden, a very large cabal of countries are trying to shut this chain down, how will the system survive? And so the whole system was designed in a way where, because you can allow anybody to run it, it has like sort of maximum resilience against any kind of threat vector. And as a result of that, has the maximum amount of security. And this is why we generally all say that Ethereum, maybe some people will argue that perhaps Bitcoin, but at this point, I think a lot of people say that Ethereum is the most secure blockchain out there. So for scalability, the question was, how do we now take this environment, something that is Ethereum or looks like Ethereum or feels like Ethereum, and make it a lot faster? And so back in 2018, the general, the kind of conclusion that everybody reached was that in order to scale a blockchain, you have to scale out, which means you kind of have to horizontally scale to more chains. This is how we generally scale servers on the internet today. Is you built the next Facebook. You're getting more and more users. Well, in order to scale up to meet those user needs, you just scale to having more and more servers and more databases, and you scale them out, and then eventually you create systems to allow those databases and servers to coordinate with each other. We're basically doing the same thing with chains. Back in 2019 or so, we kind of discovered the model of rollups, which is a way to have other chains that look exactly like Ethereum, or perhaps can even do other things, but that are fundamentally secured by Ethereum. So you're getting this Ethereum security benefits, but you're on this other chain-like environment, which has its own capacity to do compute and has its own speed, and it isn't affected by the pace of the underlying chain, the pace of Ethereum itself. Now, this is where the interop piece comes in, because in order to get from this alternative environment, the rollup, say it's Arbitrum, for instance, to Ethereum, you have to have some bridge, right? You have to have some mechanism to communicate between these two environments. Now, rollups is a design that the whole point of a rollup was to have this kind of enshrined bridge, to have a mechanism intrinsic to the rollup itself that makes it so that it relies on the underlying chain. In fact, the first paper that introduced the concept of rollups, and a lot of people don't know this, it was written by John Adler and McCara, Quentin Collins, but the first paper that described rollups was actually called Trustless Two-Way Bridges to Sidechains by Halting. It described a mechanism where you could bridge to another chain, as long as the other chain, there's basically a parent-child relationship between the chains, and as long as the other chain was able to halt if something goes wrong. For us as Connext, we ended up in this direction of interoperability because we realized, okay, the world is just going to be chains and bridges in the future. That is it. These are the two market categories. They're going to be equally valuable. They're going to be equally important. And in order to try to solve this scalability problem, we and ideally do it in a way that actually has good user experience, we not only need to be able to create many rollups, we need to create ways for these rollups to communicate with each other that are not just the native rollup bridges, because of course these native rollup bridges go through Ethereum, and when you're then you end up creating the same problem again, where any communication that happens between these chains ends up then being bottlenecked by Ethereum itself. So just you get back to the exact same scalability problem. Now, how have bridges kind of developed? One thing that we've seen, and so we as a team were always very L2 focused, and so our kind of core focus was, how can we build a system that relies on Ethereum for security, right? Because it's like we see bridging as just an extension of the L2 problem. But I think for a lot of other people, this was not the case, right? There was a whole field of interoperability between blockchains that people had been thinking about prior to this, that was looking at other mechanisms for kind of validating, like communication between two independent chains that are not kind of fundamentally tied to Ethereum. Now, it's awesome that the space has moved away from that, instead towards this like rollup centric world that we're living in. In fact, the number of rollups is really accelerating. But back in 2017, back in 2020, 2021, which is really when this like whole multi-chain world started taking off, there wasn't really a need to have the same kind of like L2 based interoperability. And so I think people started experimenting with other approaches, and really because a lot of those other approaches are simpler and easier to implement or easier to think about, and because this L2 based interoperability mechanism was just not something that had been researched enough yet at the time. So some of the early bridge approaches were things like multisigs, right? Because what is a bridge really doing? A bridge is just a set of people that are attesting something that happened on chain A is valid to chain B. And the security of that system is, of course, dependent on who is attesting that, right? So if you have a multisig, who are the 3 to 5 people on that multisig that are saying this thing that happened over here should be reflected over here? And then as you kind of scale up in bridge security, you just basically are scaling up the number of people that are doing that attestation, right? So eventually you started having things like POS systems, POS blockchains like Axelar, for instance, that have a chain A and chain B that are communicating with each other. And then they have chain C that sits in between. And chain C is the thing that is attesting, the state transitions, the like updates between all of these chains. And then eventually, beyond that, the kind of next frontier here is basically light clients, specifically ZK bridges is what this is frequently referred to as, where you have one of the chains, chain A, is directly attesting to the validity of chain B, and chain B is directly attesting to the validity of chain A. But of course, in this case, the kind of the people that are providing the security are the validators of chain A and the validators of chain B. And you could kind of think of this as its own multisig, right? It's a made up of the people that are securing each chain. And so in theory, that's giving you just as good security as the chains themselves. This is the way that like bridging has kind of evolved. It's like we've over time, similar to kind of Ethereum itself, we've kind of realized, okay, what we need to do is make it possible for more and more people to validate that this state is correct on chain A and make it appear on chain B. But I think something that naturally comes up here is that you might notice we've ended up in the same spot as we have before. You've kind of created a chain that sits between chains, or you've put an implicit dependency on like one of the chains to be the chain that is providing the security.
Right.
And if you do that, you kind of end up in the same spot as Ethereum, where it's like now everything's bottlenecked by this one chain. And so, from my perspective, I don't see that as very fundamentally different than like just having Ethereum be the like intermediary chain that is providing security. And of course, it's best for Ethereum to do that because Ethereum is providing the most security out of any system out there, right? Why create a new system to provide that security? And so what we realized is that there's actually, and we kind of stumbled upon this back in 2021, but we realized that it probably doesn't, there's a case to be made for having this like slow, expensive bridging that is very, very secure, that it kind of happens under the hood between chains. But that's still probably not something that is going to solve the user experience of, I have my money on Arbitrum and I want to go interact with an application on Optimism. Because if you're a user that is in that situation, you don't want to go and pay $30 to bridge. You don't want to go and like wait, 5 to 10 minutes for the chain to kind of achieve consensus on this state, this like transaction that you made. What you want as a user is you want it to happen in milliseconds, right? You want to basically just send a transaction. You want to interact with an application. You don't want to ever have to think about what chain you're on. You just want to like send a transaction to the application and it should just go through. And this is where intents come in. So intents are another way to kind of think about this problem. They're not mutually exclusive with the underlying solutions. In fact, intents require you to have some underlying mechanism for the kind of slow, expensive message bridging.
Right.
But the intent kind of separates it into two problems in the same way that scaling separates security and execution into two different problems. What intents say are you shouldn't need to secure every single message. In the same way that rollups say you don't need to secure every single transaction. You just need to proofs that those transactions happen correctly, and then have those proofs be verified by Ethereum or the underlying secure system. So how does an intent work? We kind of stumbled upon this model back in 2021 because we were very big fans of a previous scalability technology called state channels and HTLCs. That's something that I think I don't want to get too deeply into right now because it'd be quite complicated. But I think for us, we realized that there was this really simple thing that you could do, which is for any instance where you as a user want to interact with something on another chain, or to do anything in this space, right? For any instance where you as a user want to go and do XYZ, you can pay somebody to do XYZ for you. That's it. That's the simple, very, very simple explainer of how an intent works. And so why would you do this? Well, interacting with an application on Optimism when you have all of your funds on Arbitrum is complex, right? You have to think about bridging, you have to think about gas, you have to think about getting a network RPC for the other chain. You have to even think about thinking about the fact that you have to get to another chain is complex. So instead, if you're just saying, I want to go and swap on Uniswap on Optimism, and you just broadcast that out to someone and say, I am willing to pay a fee to anybody that just does this for me. And here is the money that I'm putting up for the swap. Once you do the swap correctly, this money will be paid out to you. What you're effectively doing is just creating a marketplace for service providers to come in and say, oh yeah, you know what? I have money on Optimism. I'm willing to do this transaction. It's cost effective for me. It's worth it for me to do this because I'm going to earn some fees for it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to front my own money to make the swap happen. I'm going to give you the results of the swap. And then I'm going to go and claim your funds back on Arbitrum so that I get repaid and of course get fees.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about intents. I mean, we haven't talked about intents yet on our podcast. So only in passing just recently. And obviously it's in 2024 is the supposed year of intents. Yeah. Everyone's talking. I'm still it would be great to just try to explain the concept maybe just with a few steps back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the way I understand the word intent, just understanding the word intent first, right? It's the way, and I'll definitely hand over the ball to you, but so where I stand is that it's like an expression of a desired end state. So when you're comparing an intent in the blockchain space, for example, you have like a transaction refers to how an action should be carried out, but intent refers to what the desired outcome or goal of that action should be, right? Just taking it like a step back.
Yeah.
And the aim with intent, if I am not mistaken, is that users just state their goal and it basically becomes more user-centric.
Exactly, yeah.
Or am I completely oversimplifying it? I mean, I'm definitely oversimplifying it, but just conceptually what it is. And then I'm just curious, of course, then why are they so popular?
Yeah.
Like you were just starting to explain and you were explaining it very eloquently, but sort of with respect to blockchains, what do they do?
Yeah.
And why are they now popular? They've been around before. It's not just 2024, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, well, they've been around in blockchains I mentioned kind of HTLCs and state channels. Those are intent-based systems.
Uh-huh.
The word intent is new, but it really describes, and I think what you've mentioned is a good explainer, right? That effectively you're separating out the thing that the user wants to do from how they actually do it. Mm-hmm. Intents are not a new concept. In fact, they're not even new in blockchain. Like it's not even like they're a blockchain concept, right? Like when you go and you pay with a credit card at a grocery store, you're expressing an intent. You don't make when you pay with your card at the grocery store, you're not actually making a bank transfer from your bank to the merchant's bank. Someone else does that.
Right.
But what you're doing is you're telling Visa, hey, I want to pay this person. Can you go do that on my behalf as a service provider? And Visa says, yes, I'll do that if you let me charge 30 bips or fees or whatever it is, 3% fees. And then Visa goes and figures out the complex process of what is your bank? What is their bank? What is going to be the cheapest and most effective mechanism for you to send a transaction from your bank to their bank? And how can we do that in a way where all of the global transactions that are happening in a large batch? So then that way we're not having to send one transaction for every user interaction, because of course sending bank transfers is an expensive and slow process. Mm-hmm. Now, if we were living in a world today where you had to actually send a bank transfer when you went to pay at the grocery store, you'd be standing in line for 20 to 30 minutes while you're waiting for that transaction to clear. That's something that is true in legacy finance. It's true in, just markets. It's true in the way that we interact with things, right? Like when you trade in the New York Stock Exchange, you're clearing transactions with each other, which means you're committing to making these transactions, but they're not settled until end of day. Mm-hmm. It's the same as when you go and you purchase property, right? You purchase the property, you don't physically get the keys until later. And I think that this is generally just how we think about transacting with each other already, because there's just a material difference. There's just in the olden days, it was the material piece of paper that you had to own in order to know that you owned a stock, right? And delivery of that piece of paper was slow and expensive, of course. Mm-hmm. And so you separated out the purchase of it from the delivery of the paper, the fulfillment of it, because you wanted to know that like, oh, I actually have received the item already. Same as, when you order an item on Amazon, for instance. So why are they important in blockchains? So I think a part of the reason is that we've created this like very slow, secure settlement system. Why are they important from a meta level? Because I think we've created this very slow, secure settlement system, and we haven't ever created a clearance system that sits on top of it, right? We haven't created a mechanism to allow people to kind of like trade with each other fast and cheap, or to like borrow fast and cheap and like do things cheaply and simply without having to like deal with the underlying chain. But I think the other reason is, and why, I think the specific question of like, why now and why are people so excited about it, is that I think people have kind of realized that like in the past, we used to assume that protocols would be very horizontally scalable. So what that means is that there would be like one DEX protocol and one lending protocol, or like maybe a couple, right? Or there would be like one L2 or maybe a couple. But that's not the world that we live in. Like it's like the marginal cost of creating a new application or creating a new L2 or really just about creating anything in this space is shrinking to zero. And we're working towards a world where like there is going to be very aggressive competition. And I think it's good in the sense that you want there to be either no competition at all because everything is a public good and is sort of horizontally scalable protocol, or you want there to be extreme competition because extreme competition drives everything to become a public good over time because everything just sort of races to the bottom, right? So it's good that we're kind of like not in this like uncanny valley in the middle. We're heading towards extreme competition. But the complexity of extreme competition is, selection. If you're a user that is trying to buy some item on Amazon and like there's, thousands of that item, how do you figure out what the best one is? And so like as a user, you have to go through this painstaking process of looking at reviews and like, figuring out which one is, what are the different trade-offs between all of them. Whereas with an intent, what you could do is just say, I want to go and buy XYZ, that it just fulfills my needs. And someone else could go and do that process of figuring out, well, what is the best way to do this for you on your behalf? So I think in this space, really, a lot of it seems to come down to the routing and complexity of the chains that the multi-chain world that we live in today, multi-chain, multi-application world that we live in today, where as a user, if you want to trade ETH for USDC and you say, I want to just get the best possible price I can for $100,000 ETH to USDC because I really, really care about price. Well, expressing that intent means that people can go and figure out, well, is the best price available on Uniswap, on 0x, on 1inch, on CalSwap, on etc. And is it available on Ethereum, Arbitrum, Optimism, all of these different options. And you just let service providers compete to give you the best result.
What could be the possible shortcomings or disadvantages of using intent-centric architecture?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So one thing that is important here is like the complexity that you're sort of abstracting away complexity for the end user.
Yes.
Right? The end user is no longer having to think about the application. They're just thinking about the trading interface. They're using Robinhood and they're thinking about the trading interface of Robinhood. They don't need to care about Uniswap or anything else behind the scenes. The complexity but that complexity still exists, right? Someone still needs to think about Uniswap and everything that's behind the scenes. So one concern is like, well, if you are outsourcing this complexity to external parties, then now those external parties are need to be experts. And, that expertise implies that they need to be actors that are doing this profitably as a business and need to be sort of putting in material work to constantly be discovering new ways of getting from point A to point B, to constantly be competitive against other people so that they can win, right? So when you create that kind of competition, and especially specialized competition, right? So you have two kinds of competition, both in the space and outside of the space. You have competition, for example, that is like unspecialized, that is truly like neutral and race to the bottom, like, for example, between validators on a blockchain, right? So every validator on a blockchain is competing against one another because they're all competing to get blocks and they're competing to earn fees for mining or validating. But there's no specialization. It's not like they can run custom code that lets them do that more effectively. And blockchains are explicitly designed to try to prevent that kind of specialization, at least in some cases, because creating that kind of specialization is a centralization vector. It means that, maybe someone like, say, Amazon can say, okay, well, actually, I'm going to go and run an Ethereum validator. I'm just going to put so much computing resources behind it that now I'm going to mine all of the transactions, or like I'm going to put so much money into the system that I'm going to like, and like that kind of it's like specialization exists in like certain vectors, but if you make it unbounded, you make it possible for people to specialize on really anything, it does lead to centralization, because as a company like Amazon, you just have an outsized ability to compete in that arena versus some individual. And then the other kind of competition is, of course, the opposite, where you do have specialization. Right? You allow people to optimize on one very specific problem. And I think the concern, and this is a totally valid concern, is that, well, you're going to inadvertently end up creating, what looks like TradFi, large-scale TradFi market-making activity, where you're going to have very specialized actors that are very, very good at solving these problems, and that will shut out the capacity for other people to be able to participate in it whatsoever. And that will just mean that all of the transactions in this space end up flowing through like a few centralized actors rather than just through like the decentralized network.
How does so given everything that you've just explained, so then how does it all, or the intents, how does it all intersect with Connext and what you're doing? Yeah.
So we realized back in 2021 that like there was this somewhat simple model. Everybody was trying to do this more complex thing of like having a multi-sig between chains, or having a chain between chains, and like basically having like one chain, trying to work towards a model where like one chain is validating another chain. And what we said was like, well, why even do that, right? Like maybe it's worthwhile to have one chain validate another chain to be able to like pass around a proof that an intent has been filled. But like, why? There's no way that model scales, right? If you're assuming that there's going to be like maybe millions of transactions, user transactions a minute or a second, right? How can you possibly scale that? You need some form of batching. You need some form of mechanism where some counterparty is just doing this thing for you, and then you're batching up all of these transactions and then only sending like a batch every few minutes or something like that instead. And this is just like a fundamental kind of property of computer science, of how you like think about making updates to like a system. Like say, for example, you're updating a database, right? Like if you want to scale that database over time, you have to kind of batch updates into the database. It's like you won't be able to just make an update for every single transaction, because it's just an inefficient system, fundamentally. And so we kind of realized that there was this need for something that looks like intents. We ended up building one of the first intent-based interop systems in the space back in 2021. It was not great. We've learned a lot since then. But we ended up making, I think, a lot of the mistakes that... Go ahead.
What was not great about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think part of it...
If you can talk about it.
Part of it was... I think we were sort of inheriting a lot of like legacy concepts from like the HTLC and state channels world. So we were doing a lot of things off chain. And so I think there was just like, there's like brittleness that comes from what is called interactivity, basically like large amounts of back and forth between people off chain. And it just creates more potential vectors where things could fail or things could just stop working.
I see.
And so what we found was we'd kind of built this system that worked quite well for the initial, 100 days, and then once we scaled past that, we were like, oh my god, this is not designed for like the level of volume that we're seeing. It's not a system that can really scale out to an infinite number of participants. And then beyond that, I think it was just like the naivety of trying to understand like this technology from first principles, right? So like now we kind of realize, okay, well, in Tense, you can have like an RFQ system that allows people to like go and request price it, like basically say, I want to do this thing. Can you give me like a quote for how much it would cost and things like that? And then you could send the transaction. But, in the original system, we didn't really have anything like that. We were the first people to really start playing around with RFQs back in 2021. But before that, we were like just kind of winging it. There's no guarantee that a user transaction was going to go through. Like the user sort of like created a relationship with an intent solver, and like the intent solver could just sort of like disappear or like just give them like awful pricing, and there was no real way for the user to do anything about it. And we didn't really like think about these things until we saw it happening in the real world accidentally, and we were like, oh, okay, yeah, that's something that we have to solve for. So I think those are the kinds of learnings that and then I think more broadly this space has adopted over time. I think after that, what we realized was we were right about the model, that there was something really magical here, right? We could allow people to do transactions across chains that cost almost nothing, and they could happen almost instantly. And in fact, we were also realized that this didn't just mean like, HTLCs, like hash time locks are a way to do atomic swaps between chains. So you could swap like BTC for ETH, for instance. And what we realized was that the model didn't have to just be limited to token transactions. It could be expanded to include users doing things across chains as well. So we implemented that back in 2021 as well. And that was, I think, like a huge breakthrough where we were like, well, this model doesn't just need to be, I'm transferring tokens. It could be like, I want to go and deposit into Aave. And doing that on any chain instantly. And it just seemed like the ultimate solution. It seemed like the direction that we were all trying to go. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of how we ended up in this path. Now, I think over time, we've, of course, like learned a lot more about this technology, about the space, how these things fit together. We've kind of, learned that in the past, we believed that like it was this method versus the like multi-sig, like client, POS validator set method. And now we're realizing, no, these two things actually fit together very well. And you need both in order for the space to work, things like that.
Fair enough. Yeah. I like your brutal honesty. I mean, yeah, but you said wing it, but I mean, how else are you going to learn by doing, right? I mean, it's pretty banal saying that, but
no one has ever built these systems ever. And like there's research on them, theoretical research, there's some modeling, but even that, I mean, back in 2021, like the research around this stuff was extraordinarily sparse, right? There was not really anything. And so we were just like, well, the only way to find out is to build it with users and like see what happens.
And try to do it. Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, fair enough. Okay. So then jumping to Connext, or unless I want to sort of put the intents then to rest a little bit. So what is then Connext today? Yeah. And what are you guys solving?
Yeah. Well, as you saw from our website, Connext is a modular intent-based. Right. We need to work on that. I think the challenge is that this technology is still, it's like so hard to describe exactly what it is. We've been talking for a while now, and it's still something that I'm sure is like quite unclear to users, because it is this like lower level thing that I think ideally users should never even have to know about.
Right.
So this is one of the reasons why we kind of like tried have been trying the HTTP of Web3 analogy, where it's like we're not trying to solve the underlying backbone of how chains communicate with each other, because we think that's actually largely solved, right? This is what the analogy here would be. TCP in the internet world is like that is the internet protocol, and we think that protocol kind of exists because rollups have bridges between them and Ethereum, like clients exist. The problem that we're trying to solve is, well, it isn't feasible to use the roll-up bridges to get from Optimism to Arbitrum today. That will take you 7 days. It will cost you hundreds of dollars. That's just not going to work for a user. You can use that for like a secure message that goes between chains that happens once every so often, but you can't use it for every single user transaction. And so what we realized was that there's a need for another protocol that sits on top of the internet. And the analogy here is kind of the shift that happened between Web 1 and Web 2. Where Web 1 was everything pre like 1990s, where it's actually very similar to what crypto looks like today, where, you as a user, if you wanted to use the internet, you had to go and connect to someone else's network.
Yes.
You had to go and...
I did.
You had to...
Right.
You had to like SSH or telnet into somebody else's network. And then you had to go and retrieve files from their network and then bring them to yours. And you had to then you could like read the files. And it wasn't until HTTP was created in the early 1990s where we went from, we kind of created this like web where you could, it was like a content-based internet where you could go to a site that somebody has put up where they're serving information to you rather than going to their home network and getting that information. And by going to that site, you didn't have to think about, I'm consciously getting out of my network to get into another network. You were just going to a URL in a browser. And so we abstracted away the whole internet from people's minds. We abstracted away the concept of the underlying network protocols, and instead we're using this like higher level protocol, HTTP, to just go and retrieve information. And this was really where the internet became usable, right? That was like, I think 1993 when HTTP was kind of started to be more widely adopted, and it was stopped being just a CERN project and started to be something that people were using. I think the internet like overnight exploded. It went from being like a few hundred websites to being tens of thousands overnight.
Right.
And I think that was really like what changed the future of the internet. And I think we're in the similar position today where it's like until we have that moment where we abstract away the chains, until we had that moment where we had this higher level protocol that just removes the need to think about what's going on underneath. We're not going to successfully onboard users.
So you're saying we're like pre-1993 with respect to what the internet was?
I'm saying that crypto's Netscape moment hasn't yet happened. Contrary to what everybody always says.
Oh, Netscape.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, there's so much theorizing on where we are. And I think, just jumping ahead and then jumping ahead to, sort of the key takeaways that I sort of, I hear from most of the founders, co-founders, whatnot, is, we're still early and it's all about adoption, et cetera. But I mean, we still have to get to the sort of micro point of what exactly we are trying to solve here to get to the next step. Okay, so back to Connext and then the use cases that just you're trying to solve or that you're offering solutions for. When I did the research, you have sort of like two main solutions. Mm-hmm. So for X, ERC20 tokens, and then you're alluding to the chain abstraction. Yeah. Maybe just if you could take us quickly through these, because just to tie it back to the bridging that we're talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think kind of and this is maybe gets to the more than a bridge piece. Like the reason that we kind of say more than a bridge is because I think bridging has come to represent one very specific thing in people's minds, which is like bridging is the underlying primitive behind all of this, right? Everything is a messaging bridge. And rollups are technically a messaging bridge and then like a server. That's it. And, I think as a result of that, like the bridging term has just become very confusing for people. Yeah. When we say more than a bridge, what we really mean there is like, it's more than just what people consider to be a bridge, which is a bridge UI that is a system that lets you just like an application that you go to transfer tokens from one chain to another. And what we realized was like there's a bunch of like core problems that exist around bridging that need to be solved before you can really get to this state. And the ultimate state, the end state of all of this is chain abstraction from our perspective. Where we define chain abstraction as a world where users never really have to think or care about what chain they're on at all. Mm-hmm. Right? You're able to use any application on any chain with any asset at any time.
Right.
And so, solving that problem is a combination of, building the infrastructure that lets you make those transactions happen, making it possible for the people that are making those transactions, so the intent solvers that are making those transactions happen, making it possible for them to have liquidity and to be able to do that very efficiently, so making it happen at a very, very good price, and then making it possible to do that on any chain. You mentioned the chain abstraction piece. That is sort of like the higher level initiative, and it's a higher level SDK and toolkit that people can use, and in fact people are already using to be able to like interact with an application from any chain. So a good example of this is a really fantastic example. This is Renzo protocol, who are a liquid restaking protocol building on top of EigenLayer. Renzo has been growing fantastically fast. In the past, I think we basically launched this concept of restake from anywhere with them, which allows users to be able to go and interact with Renzo's protocol, but do it from L2. So they're not having to pay high gas costs. Mm-hmm. They're not having to pay like the transaction fees of Ethereum. They're not having to like deal with the overhead of like bringing their funds back to Ethereum L1 to be able to use this app, right? Mm-hmm. What Renzo is doing is what all startups should be doing, which is going to where their users are rather than making their users come to them. And it's working, right? I think we launched this about a month ago with them. And in that time, we've already onboarded about $100 million of liquidity from Arbitrum, which is amazing. Crazy.
Yeah.
It's insane.
That is insane. I saw that. Yeah. I saw that on the Twitter account.
Yeah, it's wild. It's really accelerating as well. I mean, you could kind of see it in like Connex's metrics, like they're going completely parabolic because this is true use case, right? This is a real thing that people are realizing. Well, I can't expect my users to just have to jump through all of these hoops to be able to get to my app. But then underpinning that, is XDRC20, which is a mechanism for bridging tokens, for being able to take tokens from one chain to another without needing to, go through a more complex process of figuring out, well, how am I going to bridge those tokens? How am I going to get liquidity for them? What security assumptions am I making? And so I can speak to that a little bit. So last year, we kind of realized, like, as I mentioned, one of the core problems of chain abstraction is going to be liquidity. How do you make it possible for someone to go and make these transactions happen in a way that's very cost effective, and in a way where they're not having to go and like bootstrap tons and tons of liquidity for every single asset, right? There's going to be millions of different assets out there. How are we going to create liquidity pools for each asset on each chain? That's not going to make sense.
Right.
And so we kind of saw that the space was heading towards, like bridging tokens directly through third-party bridges, things like Layer 0's OFT or Axelar's ITS. These are token standards that are, they're basically token implementations created by these systems that allow you to bridge a token from one chain to another. And what they're doing is basically like taking a token on Ethereum, burning that token, and then like minting it somewhere else. And this is theoretically optimal for liquidity. You don't need to have any liquidity providers or anything like that to do this. But the flip side of it is that you are completely beholden to the security of the system that is burning and minting your token. Mm-hmm. They can really do whatever they want with it because they're controlling the token supply entirely. Mm-hmm. And then you have the other, like altogether opposite end of the spectrum model, which is what a lot of token issuers do, which is how, Ethereum gets, like ETH gets bridged, which is, you take ETH, you lock it into like a roll-up bridge or something like that, and then a representation of ETH gets minted on the roll-up bridge, and that's the canonical representation. That's the official one, because you assume that the roll-up bridge is the canonical bridge. And the problem is that the bridges, the other third-party bridges like Connext or Layer 0 or really anybody else, we don't have the rights to mint canonical ETH on these chains. And so what we have to do is go and build liquidity of canonical ETH. And so, we have to have a pool of ETH on each chain. And, we have to transfer when a user comes and says, hey, I want to transfer 100 ETH from this chain to this chain, we have to go and add 100 ETH to the pool here and remove 100 ETH from the pool here. And that works. But of course, that implies having pricing. You need to have slippage on pools in order to make them efficient to rebalance and things like that. And it also implies liquidity constraints, right? So if we run out of ETH on this pool, there's really no way for a user to complete that 100 ETH transaction. And then it gets kind of messy because how do you revert it? How should the user, what should the user experience look like? That's an open question. XERC20 looks at like both of these two options, which are both very unideal, right? One option compromises on security and one option compromises on liquidity. And the XERC20 approach, which is an EIP, by the way, it's EIP 1287. Which is it basically looks at this trade-off space and says, well, maybe there's something in between. Maybe the token issuer, with the trade-off of potentially having a little bit more overhead to manage, can granularly control when and how, like allow tokens to be minted by a bridge or any number of bridges, but granularly control when and how those tokens can get minted. So you can have the benefit of, I can work with multiple bridges. I can work with canonical bridges. I can work with bridges like Connext. I can work with, Layer 0. I can work with whatever. But I don't have to have the entire security of my token be reliant upon the security of these systems. Mm-hmm. Instead, what I can do is I can set limits on the amount of my token that can be minted by each bridge at a given time on a given chain. Okay.
Thanks for that. You've alluded to the liquidity portion, which I definitely wanted to ask. And then, but one of my biggest always concerns is of course, it's always, as a user, you don't want to think about things and you just want to have plug and play, but just security.
Yeah.
That's, for me personally, it's like a big thing. And my question is, how do you, maybe if you can talk a little bit more about how you solve for security, and then, which actually a little while back I wanted to ask, also one of the big criticisms of, bridge problems is trust.
Yeah.
I mean, as we all know, millions were exploited and lost in bridge hacks. Not to mix everything up here, maybe before you I ask you how you solve for security, I'm just curious, in your opinion, what were the most prominent bridge hacks that perhaps changed or ignited further security thought or an overall development, for example? Or maybe if you can even comment on what should have been done in some of these crazy things that have happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think to understand why bridge security is so hard, I think you have to kind of remember that, like, as I mentioned earlier, this interchain world is just all going to be bridges and chains.
Bridges and chains. I know it keeps echoing in my head. I'm like, really?
Yeah. And it's crazy. And those are the sort of two fundamental pieces of all of this, right? And I think that we have had, since 2008, we have had an implementation of a blockchain that works, and we all know works, which is Bitcoin. And every single blockchain that exists, I mean, maybe not every single one. There are definitely a lot of people that have done a lot of really weird things, but every single like popular blockchain framework that exists that really custodies a lot of value is in some way or form derived from the original Bitcoin code base.
Right.
And the original Bitcoin code base was like run in production for a while. There were issues with it, and like those issues were solved, and all of those issues were fixed long before people started like, forking it to do completely unique things that like Ethereum, right? Like doing things that are completely programmable and open.
Right.
And so we've had like, almost 14 years now to like 16 years. Oh my God, to like work on blockchains, to like build secure blockchains. We have not had that kind of time for bridges. I think big part of the reason why we saw so many hacks in 2021 and 2022 was that bridges as a market category really just like appeared out of nowhere. And people started like jumping into this because everybody realized just how valuable it is, right? Like this is $1 trillion industry. Like this is $1 trillion vertical within the space. And I think everybody realized, well, there's a huge opportunity to be one of the earliest players here, but only if you move fast. And I think a lot of projects that hadn't, or like people, individuals, companies that hadn't really like had, anything yet and hadn't really like dived deep into this topic ended up going and building bridges as a way to kind of make an impact in the space. And it's awesome that people did that. But I think the flip side of it is, of course, like people went to market with systems that had never, like trying to create a system that had never been built before, that was going to custody immense amount of value, and did that in a matter of months, which is crazy. It's insane. And I think it is not surprising that we have ended up where we have, right? It's like, it is bridging and interop between chains, and just like building blockchains themselves is a very difficult thing. It will take many years to get to the point where we have stable, mature implementations of underlying technology that we can trust and know work at scale. And even then, there's still a risk, right? Like we're still finding bugs and exploits that exist within internet protocols to this day that have been created like decades ago.
Right.
So I think this is one of those things where, we need to, I think what we needed back in 2021 was like a more measured approach. But I think that the incentives just drove, like there was just such a need for it that the incentives drove the space towards not having that measured approach, towards models where like people just didn't really know how to evaluate it. As a user, you didn't really know how to evaluate the security of bridges, right? You looked at two options, and one option gave you extremely cheap pricing and one option gave you more expensive pricing. You didn't really think to be like, well, okay, what is the security difference between these two? Because this option is like actually using like a large validator set and has been, is like very battle tested, or is using white clients or whatever. And then this option is basically just a single server and someone who has their key and is just basically making these transactions happen completely custodially. And there's no way to like look at these two things and say, well, I'm verifying that this one is correct and this one isn't, because it was all off-chain infrastructure. So there's no way to verify that for yourself either. I think things are starting to change. This is one of the reasons why we are such strong proponents of this model, that like we believe the underlying security of message bridging is a solved problem, because we're strong proponents of rollups for this reason, is because like rollups come with their own enshrined bridge, and like there are now very mature rollup frameworks that have been battle tested for a while, and you can be, at this point, there's like a decent amount of confidence that you can have that like the Arbitrum rollup bridge is secure. And so if you're using the Arbitrum rollup bridge as the like security basis for communicating between Arbitrum and Optimism, like the Arbitrum rollup bridge and Optimism rollup bridge, to communicate between those two chains, you can be confident that those bridges are like less likely to get hacked at this point. And that has been our hypothesis. Is there anything that has like kind of changed our minds and the philosophy of the space to head in this direction? Yes. I think the really, really big hacks from 2022 in particular, one of which we were like tangentially affected by. So the really big hacks were Ronin, which was like brutal. And really that's like a testament to like, yeah, you could have a 7 out of 8 validator set, but like,
oh my gosh, yeah,
operator failure is a thing that happens, and it's going to happen. This is why you need large decentralized networks to validate these things. So that was big hack number one. Big hack number two was Wormhole. Similar situation where it was like it wasn't really Wormhole's fault. It was just like a dependency thing, right? There's so much complex dependencies on each chain that you have to think about. And if somebody updates a dependency, that can now be a vulnerability. And then option number 3, which is Nomad, which was just like, it's just hard to do these things, right? Like Nomad's issue was just a something that slipped into an upgrade that like auditors didn't catch, nobody really caught, and it was just like a storage slot issue where no one even really hacked it. Like it was something that a user discovered by mistake, and then people just jumped onto it. And it's unclear whether someone would have discovered it, and it's unclear whether Nomad may have ended up fixing it in the future without people realizing. So like it's like even by accident these things can happen. And I think that was really like when the space. It's very clear that people's sentiment towards bridges is like very different now, and it's valid. I think it's a fair response. Like I think my sentiment towards bridges is very different now as well. I think that was really when people started to like take a step back and think through, well, okay, like is it worthwhile for us to start building with bridges right now or wait? And I think a lot of projects just decided to wait, and I think that was a good plan. Like I think it was good that the market crash happened when it did. I think it gave time for all of us, like all bridge projects, to spend time thinking about our architectures, to spend time thinking about what problems do we want to solve, right? Like what are the things that we can excel at, because it's not going to be possible for everybody to solve everything. And how can we make sure that we are truly excelling at these things in time for the next bull market? Will bridge hacks happen this time? Undoubtedly, because it is still possible. There's still new bridges being spun up all the time, right? There's still like a very valuable market category to build in and invest into. But my hope is that what we can do is abstract away the security, right? We can make it so that there's a bunch of projects that are responsible for security, for securing messages that go between chains. And then people are just kind of building on top of that. And I think that kind of layered approach where as a provider, as a person that's building an application in the space, you're not having to think about that specific problem because someone else has already solved it, I think we'll do better. And that is the philosophy that we have as well for Connext.
I mean, do you think, are these hacks getting more, I'm more of a layperson in this than just thinking, are these hacks getting more sophisticated, or are they just getting repetitive, just in a different framework, in a different way? I'm not sure if I'm actually verbalizing that correctly, but yeah,
it's a good question.
You know what I mean? Like, are they just getting so sophisticated that is there a fear that they're too sophisticated for the, I don't know, your defense mechanisms?
Yeah. So Connext has been hacked once back in 2018. It was for $10,000. At the time, it was mortifying to us because we were like, oh my God, $10,000. It was crazy because it was so much money at the time.
Yeah.
And luckily the funds were returned. We were able to kind of like speak to the hacker, and the hacker was like, oh, I actually support your project, whatever.
Oh, you actually spoke to the hacker?
Indirectly through the grapevine.
Or, well, communicated somewhat.
Yeah.
It wasn't just taken leave. Okay.
Exactly. I think we ended up paying like a security bounty, which is frequently what ends up happening, right?
Okay.
So I think we were lucky, but I think one very, very important thing we learned at the time, and this lesson has held true, is that almost all of these hacks happen because of something stupid. Almost always. And it's never something where you're like, oh, there was this very sophisticated attack where the attacker was just more clever than we were. In most cases, it's people were just like lazy, or
like just
something
human
was
error.
Missed. Yeah, exactly. Like the Ronin bridge hack, right? That happened because it was like social engineering, and it was the stupidity of having like 4 keys on a single machine, which is just ridiculous. And then it was social engineering for the last key. Wormhole, they had explicitly labeled the exploit as an issue in GitHub.
Oh.
They had a PR that was ready to fix the exploit in GitHub. Nobody had merged it yet.
Oh, wow.
So like anyone could have gone and, just seen the exploit.
That's crazy.
And it's stuff like that. And like in Nomad's case, right, it was just it wasn't even like anybody intentionally tried to hack them. It was that someone accidentally sent a message on chain that had botched parameters, and the botched parameters led to them getting more funds than they initially put into the system. And then because of the MEV space, and because there are like bots that live in the mempool today that are looking for opportunities where they're like, oh, if I create this transaction and I receive more than I sent, then that's a profitable transaction. A bunch of MEV bots just started front running that and started building their own transaction. Then more people found out about it, and then everybody just piled into it. So it was like, that was why it happened, right? It wasn't like a, and it's stuff like that where it's like, like even like the parody hack that happened back in like 2019, right? It was like what happened there. It was some GitHub user was like, oh, I accidentally deleted the contract, and now hundreds of millions of dollars worth of funds are just gone.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Yeah.
It's almost always stuff like that. And I think that's one of the challenges of building the space of trying to do security, is that it's like you do have to have that constant vigilance, right? You have to
Right. Obviously, always be on your toes.
Yeah. Kind of crazy.
Yeah. So do you see, just looking at the use cases that are mostly used, just looking at your ecosystem, do you see Connext serving more mostly DeFi related use cases for now?
Yeah.
I mean, I did see your partners that you also cover NFTs and gaming. I saw Unlock Protocol in there, which we actually hosted them a while back. It was pretty cool. It's just super cool to see the connections and integrations between projects when we're actually talking to people.
Yeah.
But I mean, is it mostly DeFi related use cases for now?
So my goal is for Connext to be used for everything.
Yeah, right.
I strongly believe that this technology is very useful for like any kind of user experience problem where like a user wants to go and do something on another chain, or basically like wants to get rid of thinking about blockchains in general, right? Like what should happen is that there should be an application, and then there should be this layer that sits in between, which looks like Connext, that is just abstracting away everything that sits behind the scenes. That said, pragmatically, the market today is DeFi, right? That's the fact of the matter. And so, we sort of have an open protocol. We try to work with everybody we can, and we want to work with a lot of innovative use cases. In fact, we go out of our way to try to support new kinds of use cases that are perhaps less valuable, but are just interesting to us. Mm-hmm. But that said, like the primary value driver of this whole space at the moment is DeFi. Mm-hmm. Will that change? I think it will change eventually. And I think, it's likely that we'll probably start seeing the roots of that change in social and gaming in this next bull market that we're heading into. Mm-hmm. And I think that there will be hype around it in the same way that just hype, always just a hype cycle, right?
Of course.
But I think the true progress will probably happen in the next cycle around those markets. Mm-hmm. So I think at this stage, we are still in a place where we really believe like the market today is going to be stuff like DeFi. It's that is going to be our bread and butter at the moment, because that is what is driving value to the space. That is what people are using blockchains for.
Right. It is the driving force.
I fought against this for a long time.
Yeah. We all want.
Years I have been saying the use case of blockchains cannot be speculating on blockchains. That cannot make sense. But
yeah, right.
The sad reality is that is the use case.
Right. Well, we all want it's all for the common good and everything. But of course, then there's the reality aspect of what's going on the sidelines. So
yeah.
Okay. So you alluded in terms of making revenue. Can you talk to about your monetization and how do you actually make money? Like where does the monetization and revenue model center on?
Yeah. So I think one way that we think about protocols and decentralized networks is that like people should be making money, and there should be an economic model within the protocol. But it shouldn't be the case that like the protocol itself is sort of directing revenue towards an individual like organization or stuff like that in the long term. Obviously, like in order to bootstrap and get there's a need to do that. Mm-hmm. But I think in the long term, like the goal is to head towards a model that looks a lot like Ethereum or other examples of successful long-term decentralized protocols where maybe there is revenue generation that goes kind of like to the DAO or to like offset network costs and things like that. But really, like the people who should be generating revenue are the network actors themselves. And in our case, those are like the intent solvers that are we call them routers that are making transactions happen between chains. Mm-hmm. So the way that model works today is it's really simple. Like when a solver goes and like when a router goes and solves a transaction, fills the user's transaction on a target chain, they charge fees for it. Right now, that's a very simple fee. It's just 5 bips. This is an example of like what I mentioned earlier, where we want to like have competition, but not have like optimized competition. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to think through the best way to do that. And so I think in the future, there might be like more competition on pricing and things like that. But at this stage, that doesn't exist. And then the protocol itself, I think in the longer term, will charge a certain amount of fees to offset its own kind of protocol level costs. So the costs of like, posting batches of transactions to Ethereum in the same way that like rollups will post batches of transactions to Ethereum, and rollups will charge fees the sequencer will effectively charge fees to like offset those costs as part of the rollup framework. Those would basically be charged as part of the core protocol. So again, it would kind of be deducted from like the funds that the user is transacting across chains, or taken as part of like a gas payment that the user pays on the source chain.
Okay. Also, I saw there's a Connext or a Connext collective, and you just alluded to DAO.
Yeah.
How is your governance set up? I mean, is Connext like a full DAO? Or yes, it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is so Connext is made up of several different organizations. It's a remarkably decentralized ecosystem, which is awesome in a lot of ways. It's a bit chaotic in others.
I'm sure it is.
We have Proxima Labs, which is the founding entity behind Connext, which Lane is CEO of, my co-founder. There's the Connext Foundation, which is a Cayman foundation, which I work at now and employs a bunch of people. And the difference between these two entities is that like Proxima is largely focused on like R&D of the protocol, and then the foundation is focused on like stewardship and like education and growth. And so the foundation does things like all the communication around what's happening in the ecosystem, around like the way that the protocol is growing, around announcements, things like that, and around like partnerships and BD and things like that. Versus Proximo is more responsible for like developing protocol upgrades. We have another entity called Wonderland, which is another like organization that is based out of Latin America. That is another sort of protocol level engineering and research and development entity. They also work on like protocol upgrades. And then there's a few other orgs that are sort of like tangentially contributing. And then all of these organizations participate in the Connext DAO. The DAO is an on-chain decentralized organization. It's actually the first like cross-chain DAO, just because we sort of dog-fooded our product really aggressively as part of building it. And the DAO is made up of basically token holders that are people that receive tokens in the airdrop, kind of like investors into the protocol for like early stage, like seed stage investors, partners and things like that. And then of course the like contributing, like the what we call the core contributors, so that these different entities that are contributing to developing the protocol. Yeah, go ahead.
And and then that's where the next token serves as the governance token.
Yeah. So our philosophy around governance, and this is something that I've kind of mentioned for a while, even prior to the token launch, is that like, I mean, we created one of the first DAO frameworks, and we've experienced firsthand how complex it is to do governance. Like governance by voting is a very inefficient mechanism, because you're basically reducing this like the purpose of governance is to get a collective of people to decide something, right? And so you're reducing the matrix of how people make that decision to a binary option vote. That is a very, very horrible simplification. And like I think that simplification, the fact that we do that, is a big part of the reason why like governance is broken, not just in this space, but also everywhere in the world, right? It's a challenging thing. Yeah. Our philosophy for protocol governance is that like over time, you should move away from a model where like you have a set of people voting on things, and instead governance should happen through like inbuilt protocol levers, right? Like incentive mechanisms where people are doing things in the protocol that then lead to outcomes that you want for the protocol. So like good examples of this would be like, I think a really amazing example of this is like what Curve did with like vote escrow tokens, where Curve realized, what are people coming to our DAO for all the time? Well, they're coming to our DAO for emissions. They're coming because they want to get token incentives for their pools. And there's so many proposals that are happening for this all the time that it's just occupying a bunch of the DAO's mental energy to have to go and like, vote on all of these proposals and do this constantly. And so what they did was they derived this mechanism for, instead of having token holders go and vote to decide who to give incentives to, instead just have them go and lock tokens in the protocol, and the protocol will autonomously direct incentives towards the pools where the tokens are locked. And so you're sort of like abstracting away the need for people to vote on this thing by taking something that people are doing all the time and turning it into an in-protocol mechanism. And of course that like ends up driving value to the Curve token, because there's now like a real legitimate use case and demand for it. We sort of see the role of governance, or at least I sort of see that. And of course, this is up to the DAO to decide in the long term whether it agrees with this view. And I do think people have different views in our ecosystem, but I personally see the role of the DAO as to be like a searching function, a function that helps figure out what are the things that are common decision-making points within the protocol that people are having to vote on all the time. things like what chains are we going to launch on? What assets are we going to support? Things like that. And then, of course, things like how are we going to give grants to XYZ? How are we going to allocate funds for whatever? And then turn those points, decision-making functions, into in-protocol mechanisms where now this is something that people can go use like the Next token directly to do in the protocol without having to like go and vote in the DAO and then the DAO has to go and do it, right? Which is just added steps. That's how we're sort of thinking about the role of the DAO and the token in the future, is this idea of ungovernance, that like eventually if the protocol is working, the DAO should, once it's sufficiently developed, the reason for the DAO should kind of disappear over time.
Yeah. DAOs can be challenging. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
And the foundation. Yeah, the DAO and the foundation and all the contributing orgs in the long term should disappear, right? It should just become like something that exists. But yeah, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, well, you mentioned, so it's one of the challenges that you probably have faced. So on a micro level within Connext, what would you say were some of the other challenges that you've gone on this ride now for, 7 years now? Aside from sort of the challenges within the DAO, what would you say have been some of your main challenges?
Yeah.
It's not an easy question.
Yeah. So I think there's basically two eras of Connext. There's like pre-2021 and PMF, and then there's like post-PMF. Pre-PMF days, I think a lot of the stuff that we were struggling with was just what a lot of the rest of the space was struggling with. Like a lot of the baseline infrastructure to build stuff in the space what didn't really exist yet. And so we had to kind of build a lot of that from scratch. And then you just had a lot of the like normal, this space had a lot of like money in it, but not a lot of like real users. And so there was a lot of like fake market signals around like things that were useful, right? So, we'd go and we'd try to like build scalability stuff for like a bunch of projects. So those projects didn't have users yet. They were just saying, oh, well, we expect these users to come at some point, but then not all of those projects really survived. And like, I think that makes it challenging, right? You sort of, if you're relying on building a system that is helping end users have a better experience, if the end users don't exist, then it's a little bit difficult to find PMF. And then after PMF or after 2021, I think a lot of the challenges have been, there's a lot of like regular startup challenges, and so there's regular startup challenges, and then there's challenges associated with the fact that you can use the startup analogy and model only for so long before you get to the point where you're like, okay, well, there's also some aspects of this which are just not startup like, right? Where this is a protocol and it's supposed to be a public good. And so there's some parts of this that are just not really going to translate very well. But I think a lot of the regular startup problems are things like, well, how do you scale an organization? How do you build a team? How do you, have that team operate very effectively? How do you make sure that there's like a high bar for success and there's accountability and things like that? And those are things that every startup has to think about post Series A. And I think everybody struggles with it, especially, I and Lane and Rahul were like, we're not first-time founders. This is definitely our first time ever scaling an organization. And so that we made all of the mistakes that everybody makes. We hired wrong. We like focused on the wrong things. We, got distracted by a bunch of stuff. We, we didn't think about PMF enough. And then eventually, we fixed those mistakes and we ended up back where we are today, which is great. I think a lot of, and I'm sure if you talk to other projects in the space, they'll say a lot of the same things, that there are just shared pieces that exist for any kind of organization.
No, absolutely. There's shared growing pains. Just what you said. On a micro level, from basically starting, your own organization and having it function and doing what you want it to do, and then the systemic part where you're trying to solve something and maybe it's not the right thing that you're solving. I'm just explaining it on a higher level.
Yeah.
How big is your team?
Yeah. Good question. It's a good question because there's so many different teams that it's hard to answer.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because there's so many different components. Yeah. You have, well, not in terms of the DAO, I guess. I don't know, just on a day basis, because you're part, or you're leading one arm of it, right? And then your co-founder is leading like the other one.
So Foundation has, I think, 12 people, I want to say. Labs has, I believe, 9-ish or something like that.
Okay.
Wonderland, they basically scale up or down based on like needs. I think right now it's like 6 to 8 people are working on Connext. And then we have other organizations that have a few people each. So I would say in total, there's probably about like 30 people that are actively working on the project, like with, being paid to do so, and are intentionally doing that as like the main thing that they're doing, or at least one of the main things. Yeah.
Right. So just a quick question, because you talked about Wonderland does what?
Wonderland is an organization that is fantastic organization. Really recommend looking them up. I think their website is defi.sucks.
Oh, literally?
Yeah.
DeFi.sucks. I'm going to write that down.
They're a collective of builders that are originally based out of Argentina, but of course now all over the place, that are interested in building public goods for the space that help push the space forward. I think they believe in Connext because they really align closely with our philosophy for the space. But what they want to do is, they act as like a contributor to a lot of ecosystems. So they are, from our side, we sort of treat them at effectively the same level as like Foundation Labs and Foundation and Labs. They are another organization that like has a very, very meaningful impact in the way that we think about like the future development of the protocol. They in fact designed our entire last protocol upgrade by themselves and also built it all by themselves. And they are their model is that they're expanding and starting to work with a lot of other ecosystems as well. But their model is that they want to basically be like a core team for protocols that are established and help those protocols succeed. And in particular, help them succeed along, and this is, I think, philosophically part of where we align really well. Like in particular, what they care about is helping protocols deliver not just on like business promises for success, but also on like the decentralization promises. So helping protocols kind of solve some of those underlying issues that otherwise they would not have the capacity to solve because they're too busy with like trying to focus on growth and success. So in Wonderland's case, like they built and maintain the Watcher implementation of Connext. That is the system that allows like basically pauses the protocol if it notices that something is going wrong. So that helps like improve security. It helps improve the decentralization of the protocol pretty significantly. Things like that.
Very cool. Yeah, that was actually the Watchers was one I wanted to cover as well back when we were talking about security. So what would you say is next or lies next for Connext? Wow, that rhymes, but I'm sure you know that. Therefore, the next token.
Yeah.
Well, I guess your arm of the organization, like what's on your short-term versus long-term roadmap plate, given everything that, well, actually you've talked about over the last hour or so, given bridging intents, all these different concepts and bringing them closer to the table.
Yeah. So I think over the course of the last year to year and a half, we have gotten to the point where we have a very, very solid understanding of a very solid vision of what this future should look like. Not just like what it should look like for users, because that's something we've known about for a while, right? Like what we said, chain abstraction. Users should never need to know or care what chain they're on. But also how we get there, like what it is, how a vision for the technology. How should Connext and other pieces of infrastructure in the space fit together to create that experience for users? We have gotten to the point now where we've like figured out exactly like what is needed to get there, the underlying technology that is needed to get there, and we're working on developing that. We're working towards a major protocol upgrade that will happen. We're targeting early summer, that we think is really going to change the way that people think about intents quite a bit. We think we're going to be able to solve one of the, we talked earlier about like the primary drawback of intents being the centralization vector.
Yes.
And that's something that we realized in 2021 and have kind of been trying to solve now for 3 years. Trying to figure out how can we make it possible for anybody to be an intent solver, at least for cross-chain stuff, maybe not for everything, but at least for this specifically. And we believe that we've cracked it as of the last like few months, which is awesome. It's super exciting. I think everybody on the team is like extremely galvanized to try to like work towards that outcome. And we're trying to balance that against, the fact that we're also growing really fast at the moment. So of course things are just crazy right now, which is amazing. But that I think is going to be our focus. And we believe that after shipping that upgrade, our goal is to head towards a world where we want Connext to become a true protocol, which means like there shouldn't really be any more kind of admin level controls in the long term. The system should be able to expand to every chain. That expansion should happen permissionlessly. And I think that today there are actually no mechanisms for intents that are permissionless to expand to new chains. And we think that's very critical. And the system should be able to like support any type of use case, right? It should be something that people can come and build new types of intents, new types of use cases on top of, without us having to like be the primary developer, the primary arbiter of like whether what ends up like being created in the first place. This is I guess a vision on our end, which we talk about, which we've sort of alluded to as like every chain, every asset. And it's something that I think we're, especially in this world that we're heading into, where like people are now starting to spin up it's like rollups are getting to the point where they're just one-click deploy. With the rollup as a service providers, we think that this is it now more than ever. This is needed, right? Developers in this next bull market will like join the space. There will be companies that will join the space that will. So I guess let me take a bit of a step back for a second.
Sure. One
thing that I've noticed, and this is a bit of a controversial thesis. A lot of people really believe that like, okay, we need consumer applications, and I agree. We do need consumer applications. But I think one thing that I've observed is that like in other cycles of technology where you have this like breakthrough technology that gets created, like the iPhone or even the internet, right? What were the first things that were created? They were not fundamentally new applications that were completely impossible in the past. It wasn't like Uber and Airbnb that were the first iPhone application, even though those were the killer applications eventually. It was, photos. It was the yellow pages on the internet. It was pets.com. It was like things like that, right? It was things that were basically just taking an existing thing and then putting it into this new thing and getting some of the benefits that you get from putting it into this new thing. And I think that one thing that I observed is that if every single bull market that we've had, every single cycle that we've had, we have drawn in a bunch of Web2 companies that have been interested in building new things on top of crypto and on top of blockchains. And those companies are bringing in large amounts of users into this ecosystem that are trying to create entirely new types of products, and they've failed, right? Like DM failed. There's been so many instances of Reddit tried to bring in like Reddit community points and things like that onto blockchains, and they just struggled with it. Even as early as like 2018, we were talking to a company called Hotspot Shield, which is a VPN provider, and they wanted to do like a decentralized VPN, and they had the market for it, right? For them, there was a very obvious problem. They were like, yeah, we don't want to host this infrastructure anymore. It's just a pain for us. We want to just open it up and let anybody else do it. And we have the users, we have everything. We want to solve the technology, but the technology wasn't there yet. I think in this cycle, for the first time, the technology is there. We have the ability for people to create chains, for companies to come and create chains that can be completely programmable, where they can do whatever they want. And those chains you don't even need to build these systems in Solidity or whatever blockchain programming language. You can build them in any language. And I think that this is my controversial take, is that I think that the growth that this space will experience will be maybe led by a few consumer applications, but largely by Web2 companies coming into this space and building rollups, building on top of this infrastructure. And we think that in order for that to work, right, it's like if the rollup is the new server, and I think the rollup is the new server, right? Okay. If the rollup is the new server, if the rollup is to Web3 what a server was to Web2, then that server has to come connected to the internet. It doesn't make sense if it doesn't.
Of course.
And so it has to come with Connext out of the box.
Controversial or not, why would you say it's controversial? I mean, have you had these conversations like within your community and people do not agree with you? Like they think that Web2, I don't know. We were talking about the Magnificent Seven coming in and developing the roll-up and sort of, I don't know, stamping their hand on everything. I don't know if that's even controversial or not. Like, I don't know.
I think it's controversial only because there's been a reactionary push, and I think this is a completely valid reactionary push for what it's worth, but basically there's been so much money that has been poured into infrastructure in the last few years that, people, and there's so many infrastructure projects that I think people are like, well, we need consumer stuff. Otherwise the space will never grow. How will we get users?
Yeah. Right.
And I agree with that sentiment. Like I do agree that we need to create consumer applications, but I don't think it's like that dire, because I do think that roll-up as a service providers, they're going to be the BD arm that goes and sells roll-ups to like Web2 companies, and that's where the users are going to come from, right? It's not like enterprise is actually a much bigger market than consumer.
Yeah.
And like people who are VCs don't always love that, right?
No.
I think users don't people in the space that are investing don't always love that, because enterprise is something that's just like harder to think about and not as many people understand it well. But the reality is that is how was the internet adopted? It wasn't because there was consumer-led adoption for sure, but a lot of it was also just like enterprise adoption. It was just not enterprise, but just like companies coming and building websites.
Yeah, I mean, I echo your sentiment. But I don't know. It's gonna be a wild ride. I think the people who are in it for, and again, we want to have people that are in it for the right reasons, which sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
But fair enough that you've talked about this point, which it is definitely very. It can be controversial. You're right. Well, given that thought, and you've talked about sort of how things are, you see unfolding, and that you guys have a clear vision of what lies ahead or how things should be. How do you think, or should we factor in the AI component of it all?
Yes.
I mean, that's probably a whole different podcast, but
yeah, it is, and it's definitely something that I could speak about for a while. I think there's two ways in which AI stuff will get factored in. The first is the interface. So like one way to think about the benefit of AI is that it's providing an interface for a bunch of things that we just didn't really have an interface in the past, right? It's like as human beings, we have ideas inside of our brains, and then we need to find some ways to turn those ideas into reality. Mm-hmm. Those ideas could be musical ideas, right? So we need an instrument, a medium to turn that idea into something. It could be like visual art. So we need a medium to turn that art into something. Mm-hmm. It could be like, concepts. We need language to turn those ideas into something. Mm-hmm. And our ability to turn ideas and thoughts inside of our mind into reality has historically been limited by the instruments that we've had. And that's always been the case, right? Now there are improvements that will allow our brains to connect to things more effectively, but I think AI sort of is sort of like improving the interface from the side of the thing that you're creating. Mm-hmm. And that is true for really anything, right? It's true for like, I want to go and learn about XYZ. It's also true for, I want to go and create this image that I'm going to use as like an illustration for something, or I want to go and create a song. There's AI models that will be able to create songs from things. And the great thing about these models is that they have text interfaces to be able to, of course, communicate with us, but those text interfaces also allow them to communicate with each other. So there's fantastical world that we're going to be able to live in is going to be something like you're going to be able to go and take a photo of something and then go to Sora, you're going to be able to go to ChatGPT and say, describe this photo in very, very intensive detail. Write an essay about this photo. And then you're going to be able to take that essay and go to Sora and say, turn this essay into a video. And then you're going to be able to take that video and say, okay, turn this video into a song.
Insane. Yeah, it's just crazy.
And it's amazing. It's like you're sort of, I think it's just going to completely open the way that we think about things.
Right.
These are not going to be different things anymore. They're going to all become the same thing, which is ideas. I think that is very closely related to intents, right? I think the idea is that like if you can create systems that allow for users to be able to express that they want to do something, like through a ChatGPT interface, right? I want to just go and I want to go trade XYZ for something else, right? You could just have a text-based interface for that, or you could have like a UI that just turns into a text-based interface. That's way simpler than going and building integrations as a developer. It's way, way simpler. And so I think like there's a few things that are going to happen when that happens. One is the ability to, this is maybe another reason why I'm bearish on like consumer facing applications. I think our ability to create consumer facing applications is going to accelerate so much to the point where people are going to be able to build new interfaces for users just literally overnight. Like it's going to be like, and not just developers, I mean anybody. And at that point, it's going to be, you can create your own customized interface in your home for the thing that you want to do. You don't need to like go into somebody else to do it. You can eventually train a model to like create interfaces that are designed in a way that appeals to your workflow for whatever it is that you want to do, right? That's crazy, but it's absolutely possible. We're not even that far off of it today. You could train models to do that today. And then the other place where this matters is like how, a lot of those underlying intents actually get solved. So rather than having a company go and figure out how to route these intents to do XYZ thing, you can just have models, AI models that are just like, well, I'm looking at all the different ways that people have transacted over the course of the last year. Here are the most efficient ones. And this is based on that. I'm going to go and route your transaction XYZ way. So I think intents in particular are particularly interesting. And part of the reason why I've been interested in, I've been interested in AI for a while, but that is a conjunction that I'm particularly interested in. And then separately from that, I think we are starting to get to the point where we are cracking the surface of the decentralized AI stuff that I talk about at the start of this podcast, where, like, my whole goal for this space, the thing that I've always dreamed of is a world where we can have AI that lives on chain, and in a way where maybe it doesn't need to live directly on chain. Maybe we can just submit proofs of it on chain as a rollup or something like that. But a way where you can ensure that, one, you can verify the outputs of whatever that AI model is saying, and two, that AI is not actually owned by any company. It is fed data by everybody, and it is owned by everybody. And as a result of that, its benefits are attributable to everybody, right? Anybody can just hold this AI token and then get value coming from any value that is generated as a result of the AI. I think there are projects already starting to work on this. And I think that it's going to take some time for sure to get there. But I think that this is probably, at least in my opinion, one of the most important things that we will do as human beings. And
what you just said, it's sort of the best case scenario of having AI involved.
Yeah.
You've rounded it up very nicely with intents. In the end, Arjun, we've talked for a while, and it's been a very eye-opening conversation. I hope that I've actually asked all the things that you wanted to talk about today. Aside from, we touched upon bridging and Connext and obviously intents. Is there anything else that you would like to add that I have not asked?
Yeah.
So much more.
I don't think so. There are definitely a lot of different places we could take the conversation, but I think...
we can open up all these different rabbit holes.
No, I appreciate the questions. I think it was really awesome to talk about the things that we did. And I appreciate that it wasn't just about bridging and intents, because I think it's important to contextualize it in the broader picture of not just the technology in this space, but also the technology in the world, and how it fits into some of the base incentives for why people behave the way that they do, and how it fits into some of the things that we do today, use cards to pay for things, how
right.
We're sort of not necessarily building new things, we're just we're going in concentric circles but in a spiral upwards, and so I think it's an interesting it's been a fantastic discussion. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no. Thank you. You did most of the work. So I didn't want to interject too much. Of course, it's all about Connext and the bridging. But I think, also the end goal is for people to have more people listen to this and realize that, bridging and intents are not just reserved for a niche, department of, I don't know, just in layman's terms, blockchain people, right? This is, we need to realize that it's a much, much broader scope that can affect just what you said, basically anything. So I really appreciate you illustrating it in that way, because it also helps me to understand the concepts without having it to be so technical.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that. And I also enjoy this conversation. Well, what is, if people want to learn more, and we'll definitely include some of the things that we talked about in the show notes, what's the best way to follow your work and what you guys are doing? Obviously the Twitter handles and all that, if you want to just let our audience know where they can refer to.
Absolutely. So I think following Connext on Twitter is a great idea. That's really one of the primary outlets for information for us. And our handle is just @Connext, so @CONNEXT.
Okay.
If you're interested in some of the stuff that I'm doing or I'm thinking about, you could also follow my handle. It's @Arjun Bhuptani. And then beyond that, I would say, if you're interested in being involved, just reach out to us. My DMs are open. And I think, you could also check out our website, connext.network. And there's a link to our Discord there. Just feel free to kind of flag somebody in Discord and say that, hey, you're interested in learning more about this or getting involved. This is like I mentioned earlier, like this is entirely breakthrough technology, and that is being built as a public good. And so I think there's just, one of the things that, like, I've talked to a lot of people who are like, well, I really want to find ways to get involved in this space. And I think this was a learning that I had pretty early on, which is that, like, people who are working this space, like, want you to get involved and, like, would love to help. If you put yourself out there, like, everybody is really, really willing and open to talk to you and, like, learn from, teach you about stuff and learn from you. So, yeah.
And you don't have to be a developer.
You don't.
I think that's also one of the friction points where, people think they have to have a developer background or hat on, and then they get intimidated and feel like they're just too stupid to contribute, which is not the case.
Anyone can learn anything.
Anyone can learn anything. No, it's very true. And so, well, Arjun, thanks so much for this talk. Again, these conversations help us make sense of these concepts. Although the end goal is, of course, the user to not worry about the back end and what happens between, layer 1s and 2s and now even 3s. It all helps to put things in perspective. And now I know what my homework is. I'm going to look up DeFi.sucks. That was one of the things that caught my interest. No, I mean, in all seriousness, this was a fantastic ride. So thanks so much. And I look forward to following your work and hear what you guys are going to come up with, like you said, before summer with Intents. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to our guests, and thank you everyone for listening. Thanks also to the Bariam Music team for providing their music. You can check them out on bariammusic.com. The episode supporting information is on our website, blockchainrecorded.com. Our podcast is available on Google, Apple, and Amazon Podcasts, as well as on YouTube, Spotify, and Radio Public. You can follow us on Twitter @Recorded Podcast and YouTube, where we are super grateful for your support. Stay tuned for our next episode.